Miss Marple notices an unsettling detail during tea at a village gathering. A shadow on the table reveals a teacup that is no longer there. When its disappearance coincides with a sudden death, the smallest clue becomes the key to a larger mystery. To unmask the culprit, Miss Marple must uncover why a missing teacup cast such a dangerous shadow. Chapter 1. A tea party's shattered calm. Late spring sun filtered through the lace curtains of Cherryford Village's community hall, casting a gentle glow over the long trestle tables draped in pristine white cloths. On this mild afternoon of May 17, 1928, the hall had been transformed into a picture of genteel delight. Delicate china teacups in pastel hues, silver trays heaped with cucumber sandwiches, scones adorned with strawberry jam and clotted cream, and vases of pale pink peonies standing like sentinels against the walls. Neighbors who had known one another for decades exchanged polite smiles and light laughter, while newcomers to the village offered cautious hellos, eager to be included in the comforting rhythms of rural life. Miss Jane Marple sat near a window at one end of the hall, her small frame partially hidden behind an umbrella of fine gray hair. She wore a simple blue dress, its soft cotton fabric folded neatly at the neckline, and her keen eyes, framed by wire spectacles, observed each guest with the same curiosity one might reserve for a lively spring blossom. To the casual onlooker, she was a kindly old lady, content to sip her Earl Grey and share an anecdote or two. Yet within those subtle lines round her mouth lay a sharp awareness of human frailties. A misplaced teacup here, a too loud whisper there, any detail that might reveal the secret tensions pulsing beneath polite society. The event, organized by Mrs. Eloise Pendlebury, widow of the late vicar, was nominally a celebration of the new village green's restoration, but in truth it offered a rare opportunity for villagers to air grievances in hushed tones. Behind the tables, Miss Marple caught snippets of conversation. Mrs. Sedgwick grumbled about the proposed tennis courts ruining the landscape. Mr. Creighton muttered about the exorbitant cost, and young Miss Hartley flirted with Mr. Benson, causing the vicar's daughter to wrinkle her brow in disapproving amusement. Even in the serene setting, alliances and animosities twisted like ivy along the walls. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Pendlebury rose from her seat beside the dais. A hush fell over the assembly as she tapped lightly on her teacup with a silver teaspoon, hoping to draw attention without raised voices. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "I thank you all for coming today. It warms my heart to see Cherryford rallying around our beloved green." She paused to lift her veil of lace, offering a brief, gracious smile. "Now, may I ask Mr. Alcott to propose the first toast?" Mr. Alcott, Cherryford's solicitor, a tall, austere man in his late 50s, stood and offered his usual bland smile. He raised his teacup in a gesture of communal goodwill. At that moment, a sudden breeze drifted in through the open door, carrying a stray petal that landed upon the table, followed by a slate blue teacup, one of Mrs. Pendlebury's cherished family heirlooms, tipping over and clattering onto the floor. The startled hush was broken by a collective gasp. "A teacup," Miss Marple thought, gently tapping her lips with the spoon as she observed. Almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, allowing her eyes to follow the arc of something darker rolling beneath the dais. The gleam of fine bone china had given way to the dull glint of metal, a small revolver, its barrel barely concealed by the hem of the dais curtain. No one had noticed its arrival. It lay quietly, as if waiting for someone to claim it. Before any guest could stoop to retrieve either the teacup or the gun, a high-pitched scream shattered the polite veneer of the afternoon. It came from the side door, where the vicar's curate, Reverend Halwyn, staggered into the hall, clutching his collar. A dark stain spread across his pristine white shirt, blossoming like a macabre flower. His face was ashen, his lips parted in a silent plea. In his left hand he held something small and white, an overturned teacup, its interior smeared with something far less innocent than tea stains. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Pendlebury shrieked and hastily clutched her hands to her throat, while Mr. Alcott barked for calm. But calm was gone. Women pressed their handkerchiefs to their lips. Men murmured urgent questions, stepping back as if to avoid some invisible contagion. Through the swirl of panic, Miss Marple rose carefully to her feet, balancing her own teacup as if it were the fragile vessel of a larger truth. She drew closer to the Reverend, who sank to his knees on the cool wood floor. What happened? Someone cried, but the curate's eyes never left the teacup in his trembling grasp. At last he whispered hoarsely, I thought it was a sugar lump. Poisoned. I fear I was fooled." Miss Marple's heart ticked in steady measure. A sugar cube, her mind noted it could be a murderer's simplest tool. Yet here, beneath the elegant veneer of afternoon tea, lay a deadly game far beyond slipshod revenge. She glanced once more toward the fallen teacup by the days, its companion, and the abandoned gun. Each piece spoke of different hands at work, one careless, one meticulous. Policeman Fletcher rushed in, his helmet askew, bringing with him the faint smell of petrol and urgency from the village green. He knelt beside the curate, examining the stain on the shirt sleeve. A cluster of petals drifted down around them as the breeze continued to poke its way through the open windows, as though nature itself bore witness to the unfolding tragedy. Amid the chaos, Miss Marple stood unmoving, her senses alive to every glance, every tremor. The village gossips would be quick to stitch together half-truths and speculation. But she, Jane Marple, had learned long ago that innocence and guilt could be found in the smallest details. An overlooked teacup handle, a hastily wiped fingerprint, the tremor of a guest's voice. Today, she would begin to gather those fragments, weaving them into the tapestry of truth. Until then, the garden party's calm was irrevocably shattered, and as worried eyes turned to the gentle figure of Miss Marple, the villagers would soon discover that under her demure exterior lay a mind, as sharp as any razor ready to cleave through polite society's illusions, and expose the darkness beneath. Chapter 2. Murmurs. Among the tea-leavest clang of the hall's front door echoed through the assembly, and one by one, the guests drifted into small clusters. Voices hushed yet urgent. Mrs. Eloise Pendlebury sank into a chair near the dais, her hand pressed to her trembling throat as she struggled to compose herself. Around her, Mrs. Sedgwick fluttered like a startled sparrow, wringing her embroidered handkerchief until its lace frayed at the edges. "I simply cannot fathom it," she murmured, eyes wide as she exchanged panicked glances with Miss Hartley, who in turn bit her lip and tried to smooth the creases of her new hat. A revolver under the dais, and poor Reverend Helwyn nearly felled by poisoned sugar. What next? At the far end, Mr. Creighton, the village accountant, tapped his polished walking cane against the wooden floor in agitated beats. "Shocking! Preposterous!" he exclaimed, his voice pitched to high, betraying his usual solemn decorum. "Who among us would dare such a deed? Cherryford has always been a placid place. There must be some dreadful mistake." Around him, younger villagers cast nervous looks, their tousled hair and rumpled frocks betraying the chaos into which a simple garden party had descended. In the corner, Mrs. Benson, a stout woman known for her outspoken manner, thrust a finger at her husband. Mr. Benson, whose cheeks reddened beneath his cravat. "Answer me this, Harold," she demanded. "Why were you so keen to escort Miss Hartley earlier? And have you ever wielded a loaded weapon in your life?" Harold Benson, typically mild-mannered and taciturn, straightened his back. "Upon my word, I only meant to offer polite escort. As to firearms, I have no familiarity beyond a distant memory of Alec Thorne's dueling pistol at Cambridge," he replied evenly. When pressed further, he shrugged and folded his hands. though Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his left thumb. Behind him, Alec Thorne, the retired army officer newly arrived from India, bristled at the insinuation, his uniform jacket unmarked and his posture rigid as if he expected an order from some unseen general. Throughout the murmuring, Miss Marple sat quietly at a small table by the window, nursing her teacup as though its contents might soothe the tension. Her shawl, pinned neatly at the shoulder with a silver brooch shaped like a sparrow, concealed the small notebook and pencil she had discreetly withdrawn from her reticule. Though she appeared to sip her tea in contemplative silence, her eyes danced from face to face, noting the faintest flicker of fear or curiosity. She observed that Mrs. Hartley pressed her gloves to her cheeks, as if still feeling the chill of justice's blade, while Mr. Creighton's cane pinched the matting beneath him, gouging lines in the fiber as he struggled for composure. "Is the Reverend likely to recover?" piped a soft voice, and all eyes turned toward the young curate, Miss Eliza Thorpe, whose bloom of youth and starched collar marked her as someone new to tragedy's heavy hand. Nurse Langley, summoned from the Pendlebury household, knelt beside Halwyn and offered him a cup of water. He drank with trembling lips, then managed a weak smile. "I believe I shall live to regret my curiosity," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "However, I fear my role in this affair has only just begun." A ripple of speculation followed Halwyn's words. Some whispered that the Reverend had long chafed under Mr. Pendlebury's austere teachings, and might have cultivated enemies among the congregation. Others recalled his impassioned sermons on morality, wondering whether some vengeful parishioner took offense at his firebrand rhetoric. Yet Miss Marple, from where she sat, noticed that the parish register in the vicar's study, now untouched by police-gloved hands, held no records of recent disputes. Instead, her gaze lingered on the empty sugar bowl perched on the next table, its clean porcelain rim untouched by half a dozen teacups. Whoever prepared that sugar bowl had handled it last, another silent witness to unfolding tragedy. As the village constable, Fletcher, began ferrying potential evidence to the vicarage office for examination, volunteers emerged to assist. Young Mr. Benson and Alec Thorne lifted the shattered teacup fragments from the day's floor and set them gently on a tray lined with clean linen. Mrs. Sedgwick hovered at their shoulders, wringing her gloves and insisting they handle each shard with utmost care. After all, it could bear the murderess's fingerprints. Her anxiety, though palpable, betrayed a keen interest in the teacup's origin. Why, among a dozen vessels, had this particular family heirloom toppled at the moment of crisis? Nearby, Mrs. Pendlebury's maid, Hilda Farnsworth, approached Miss Marple with a timid curtsy. "Begging your pardon, Mum, but might I have a word in private?" she murmured. The older woman's eyes softened, and she waved the maid to her side. In a hushed exchange, Hilda revealed that she had arrived early to prepare the hall and had noticed a single sugar cube missing from the private serving dish, an odd occurrence. She felt certain, for Miss Hartley always handled the sweets. "I fear someone might have taken it to hand to Reverend Halwyn," she whispered, voice trembling. "I saw Miss Hartley near the sugar." Miss Hartley, overhearing only the faintest echoes of the accusation, blanched and stammered. I brought only my own confection in my purse. I didn't touch the bowl." She cast her eyes downward, and her gloves caught the light as she clenched her fingers. Yet in that tremor, Miss Marple noted more than guilt, a flash of indignation, as though Miss Hartley felt wrongly accused. The newcomer's slender form shook, but her eyes remained bright, suggesting that her fear stemmed not from murderous intent, but from the sting of public suspicion. By now, the murmurs had swelled into a chorus of theories. Mrs. Benson insisted that the poisoned sugar must have been meant for Mrs. Pendlebury herself, given the heirloom teacup's proximity. Mr. Creighton countered that the revolver's position beneath the dais suggested an attempt to ambush the solicitor, who regularly negotiated wills and estates, stirring hardened resentment among those left penniless. Miss Eliza Thorpe, still pale, ventured that perhaps Reverend Halwyn uncovered some hidden secret in the church registry and was being silenced before he revealed it. Each conjecture carried a measure of plausibility and danger as villagers cast quick glances at one another, gauging who might have motive enough for murder. Throughout these speculative debates, Miss Marple remained composed, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap as she toyed with a row of stitches she intended for her niece's shawl. Yet in her mind, she catalogued every theory, assessing each against the tangible facts: the missing sugar cube, the toppled teacup, the hidden gun, and most importantly, the single petal of pale pink peony that lay crushed beneath the curate's elbow. Its fragrance faint but undeniable. It spoke of proximity, someone brushing against the day's drapery before stepping away, and of caution. Once the gun slipped free, the breeze only nudged it forward, as if nature itself conspired to conceal the crime. Late afternoon light slanted through the lace curtains, illuminating the swirl of dust motes dancing above overturned chairs. As the police sergeant began taking formal statements, one by one, Miss Marple rose and approached the dais. Her movement was unhurried, graceful as a cat's, and for a moment the crowd fell silent, sensing that the gentle figure before them bore more than a simple spoon. She reached out, lifted the petals that had fallen near the revolver, and tucked them carefully into her reticule. Then, softly but with authority, she spoke. "We must remember, dear friends, that fear and confusion are the criminals here. Only by remaining calm can we see the truth clearly." Her words, though mild, carried the weight of quiet command. Gradually, the villagers straightened their posture and exchanged sheepish apologies for overheard accusations. The sergeant nodded at Miss Marple respectfully, recognizing in her an ally rather than a meddler. As the crowd dispersed, some to the hall's outer porch for fresh air, others to the vicarage study for questioning, Miss Marple stayed a moment longer by the dais, letting her gaze rest upon each clue: the petal, the fragments of china, the faint dent in the carpet where the guns butt had pressed. Then, with a slight nod to herself, she turned and joined Nurse Langley, offering assistance in tending to Reverend Hal Wyn. Thus, the village's first wave of panic subsided into a tense anticipation. Gossip would resume in every cottage and tea room, and by nightfall, Cherryford would ring with every possible explanation for what had transpired. Yet Miss Marple, armed with her patient observations and unshakable calm, knew that the true key lay not in frantic theorizing, but in the silent testimonies of porcelain shards and crushed petals. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the day to visit the vicarage, to examine registers and personal letters, to speak with those whose voices trembled most readily. For now, she sipped the last drops of her cooling tea and allowed herself a faint smile, certain that beneath Cherryford's murmurs lay the stillness of truth waiting for her to unravel it. Chapter 3. Whispered confessions and hidden cursed. Morning mist clung to Cherryford's hedges, softening the outlines of thatched roofs and dew-laden rose bushes. By 8 o'clock, the village stirred to life. The baker's cart rattled past the vicarage gate, sending a waft of freshly baked bread across the cobbles. The postman delivered letters stamped with the day's date, his whistle cutting through the dawn chill, and Miss Marple herself stepped quietly from her cottage gate, shawl pinned at her throat, notebook and pencil tucked safely in her reticule. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to observing the world, without imposing upon it, fully aware that the secrets she sought often revealed themselves in the most ordinary details. Her first call was to Reverend Halwyn's lodgings, a modest cottage at the edge of the village green. Nurse Langley had arranged for him to rest, still pale from the shock of yesterday's events. But his eyes sparkled with determination as he greeted Miss Marple at the door. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice still husky. "I trust you slept well?" "I did, thank you," she replied, stepping over a threshold strewn with violet-smelling sachets. "And you? How do you feel after such a distressing ordeal?" "Much better, thanks to Nurse Langley," he said, gesturing toward the small sitting room table where a china teacup sat half full of chamomile tea. "I confess I have not had the heart to touch anything stronger." He offered her a chair by the window, its sill lined with pressed ferns and a handful of correspondence. As Miss Marple settled into the cushion embroidered with tiny daisies, she allowed her gaze to drift across the room. On the mantelpiece, a framed photograph of the late vicar, his kind eyes fixed upon her with paternal fondness. On the bookshelf, well-thumbed volumes of sermons interspersed with local parish newsletters. And on the floor, a single sugar cube wrapper near the hearth, its paper edges curled and stained. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Reverend, may I ask about your sugar bowl?" "Yesterday, Nurse Langley mentioned the private serving dish was complete when she prepared it." The curate's brow furrowed. "It was, indeed. Yet I did notice, upon waking this morning, that one of my wrapped sugar cubes was missing not from the bowl itself, but from the small box where I store them." He tapped a neat wooden box on the table, its lid free of dust, revealing 3 remaining sugar cubes. "I thought little of it until Nurse Langley pointed out the odd coincidence." "That is curious," Miss Marple murmured, jotting a note. "If someone removed a cube before the party began, it would explain how you received just that one." She paused, letting the silence fill the room like a gift. "And did any of the press-on labels on the wrappers bear markings?" The curate shook his head. "No, just Mrs. Pendlebury's handwriting on the wrapper itself, for afternoon tea." Miss Marple folded away her notebook. "Thank you, Reverend. Your assistance is most appreciated." She rose to leave, but paused at the doorway. "One more thing, had you noticed anything unusual in your correspondence? Visitors dropping by unannounced? Letters arriving without an envelope?" He considered, rubbing his chin. "Now that you mention it, I did find a note slipped under the door late last week. No envelope, just a single sheet inscribed with a loose invitation. Meet me under the peony tree. Truth awaits." I took it as the whimsy of a mischievous parishioner and discarded it. Miss Marple's lips curved. Truth indeed can be discarded as easily as a scrap of paper. She slipped outside, the gentle clack of her shoes on the flagstones marking her departure dot by mid-morning. News of Miss Marple's visit to the curate had spread through the village. Ginger-haired children on their way to school pointed and whispered, while housewives paused in doorways to speculate on the gentle sleuth's next move. Yet she, unfazed by the newfound attention, made her way to the Pendlebury estate, where Mrs. Eloise Pendlebury received her in the tidy drawing-room, overlooking a rose-dappled courtyard. "My dear Miss Marple." Mrs. Pendlebury greeted her with a weary smile, offering a cup of Darjeeling. "I cannot thank you enough for your careful assistance. One feels so powerless when the household teeters on scandal. I am happy to help." Miss Marple replied, accepting the tea. She surveyed the room, a Persian rug laid across polished floorboards, family portraits in gilded frames, and on a side table, a silver tea service polished to perfection, its handles gleaming like small moons in the morning light. Yet one piece of china was conspicuously absent. "You'll forgive my maid, Hilda, for worrying you," Mrs. Pendlebury said, noticing Miss Marple's glance. "The missing sugar cube has caused quite a stir in the kitchen. Hilda insists she locked the sugar drawer herself." Miss Marple inclined her head. "May I speak with her?" Within minutes, Hilda Farnsworth stood before them, bonneted and awkward. "Good morning, ma'am, Miss Marple," she said in a soft voice, wringing her hands. "I hope I'm not intruding on your investigations." "Not at all," Miss Marple assured her. "Could you tell me precisely when you prepared the sugar for yesterday's tea?" Hilda took a breath. I arrived at 9:30 to arrange the tables. I fetched the sugar from the dresser in the pantry. Mrs. Pendlebury keeps it under lock and key there, and filled the serving dish. I locked the drawer again and left the key on the sideboard, under the silver tray where the teacup stood. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Mrs. Pendlebury. "And when you returned to refill the dish after the third round of tea?" "I did not," Hilda admitted. "Once the tables were set, I remained in the kitchen cleaning up. I only heard the commotion when Nurse Langley rushed me." Miss Marple tapped her pencil. "So the sugar dish remained untouched from 9:30 until 3. Except for the removal of one cue band, no one else had access to that drawer." "Only Mrs. Pendlebury and myself," Hilda replied. "Though Miss Hartley did slip into the pantry for a private moment, I believe." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did you notice her carrying anything, a book, a bag, perhaps?" Hilda considered. She clutched a small reticule. It looked as though she were hiding something. But then she paused at the dresser, and I thought she simply wanted a moment of quiet. "And did she emerge with her reticule full?" The maid hesitated. I didn't look inside." "Thank you, Hilda." Miss Marple closed her notebook. "That will be all for now," as the maid curtsied and departed. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Pendlebury. "The sugar cube may have come from your private stash, but its absence seems to implicate someone who knew precisely where to find it, and who sought solitude long enough to retrieve it." She sipped her tea. "I wonder whether Miss Hartley could explain her purpose in that pantry." Her next stop was the village tea shop owned by Mrs. Amelia Sedgwick, whose reputation for gossip was matched only by her skill with sponge cake. The bell over the door tinkled as Miss Marple entered, and a swirl of warm air and vanilla scent greeted her. Mrs. Sedgwick, perched on a high stool behind the counter, offered an exaggerated curtsy. "Miss Marple, how delightful. The whole village is aflutter with news of your inquiries. Can I tempt you with a slice of my new rosewater tort?" Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps another time, Mrs. Sedgwick. I'm here to ask about Mr. Creighton's cane. Might I inspect it?" The gossipy matron raised an eyebrow. My Mr. Creighton's walking cane? He was so flustered yesterday that he may have left it behind at the hall." She leaned forward, her elbows on the counter. "It's a handsome thing, mahogany shaft, silver handle with a crest of his family arms. He uses it as a metronome for his temper, with Mrs. Sedgwick's permission." Miss Marple examined the cane's tip, finding a small smear of dark soil around its rubber ferrule. She touched it delicately with a handkerchief and sniffed, catching a hint of something sharp, perhaps the residue of crushed flower bulbs or garden manure. She murmured. "Where would Mr. Creighton have last used his cane outdoors?" "Oh, probably in the rose garden at the vicarage," Mrs. Sedgwick said. "He frequents the vicar's parsonage grounds, claiming the propinquity of Flora soothes his nerves." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you." She placed the cane in her reticule and paused. "And about the rosewater tort, any chance you used peony petals in the frosting?" Mrs. Sedgwick's eyes flickered. "Of course not. I would never sully a cake with peony. They're too bitter." She forced a laugh that faltered into a cough. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Yet yesterday a single peony petal lay crushed beneath the days." She replaced the cane. If anyone wished to hide the scent or confuse the evidence, substituting rosewater would be clever indeed. By midday, Miss Marple had gathered enough fragments of testimony to outline the day's errands. A visit to the vicarage rose garden, a call at the chemistry shop to inquire about local poisons, and a final stop at the village hall to inspect the hidden corner she had deferred until sunlight filled those shadowed spaces. She paused at the vicarage gate, greeting Mr. Reynolds, the head gardener, who stood wiping his spade on his trousers. "Good day, Mr. Reynolds," she said. "Might I ask whether you disturbed the soil near the days before yesterday's party?" The gardener's bushy eyebrows were upon. "Disturb the soil? hardly only to plant some new begonias near the walk. The dais was set upon planks to protect the grass, yet I did notice the dais shifting slightly when I dragged the boards back to the shed this morning. Some of the bolts were loose bolts, Miss Marple repeated, crouching to inspect the edge of the dais. Indeed, a small gap gaped where the planks had separated, revealing damp earth beneath. She pressed a finger to the soil and found a shallow indentation and outline of a small object. Looks as though something lay there long enough to press the boards down. Reynolds nodded. And when I moved it, I thought at first it was a stone. Miss Marple stood, brushing a speck of dirt from her skirt. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. She tucked the note of this new clue, the indentation, into her reticule. Her penultimate errand led her to Mr. Bartholomew Crane's chemistry shop, a narrow, leaded windowed building on Market Street. Inside, glass jars of powders and tinctures lined the shelves, and the air held the tang of alcohol and earth. Mr. Crane, a lean man with pince-nez spectacles, greeted her with polite curiosity. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure this fine morning? I wonder whether you can advise me on common poisons accessible to villagers, a substance tasteless, odorless, yet potent enough to fell a man with a single sugar cube. Mr. Crane fetched a leather-bound grimoire of plant-based toxins and flipped to a page on belladonna. Belladonna extract can be refined into a nearly colorless liquid. 1 drop in tea can prove fatal, yet its crude form leaves a faint metallic taste detectable only to the most discerning palate. And would traces remain on a sugar cube? Indeed, the sugar easily absorbs the fluid, though a faint stain might be noticed if held to bright light. He peered over his spectacles. Are you investigating a poisoning, Miss Marple? She inclined her head. A relative of mine experienced symptoms akin to belladonna poisoning: dry mouth, dilated pupils, and delirium, though in Reverend Halwyn's case it was mercifully mild. Mr. Crane nodded gravely. I shall provide you with a small magnifier and some testing reagents. If you find any residue on the cube wrappers or teacup fragments, it would confirm belladonna. With a package in hand, Miss Marple prepared for her final visit, the village hall itself. As she passed beneath the tall oak doorway, the afternoon sun had shifted, casting keen shafts of light into the corners she had pored over with previous midday shadows. She knelt beside the dais, prying upward a plank with the tip of her parasol. Beneath, she discovered a slender leather-bound notebook, the pages blank save for a single entry, inelegant. Script, May 16, 1928. Meet me at the dais at 3. Come alone. Miss Marple traced the handwriting with her fingertip and murmured. So the dais was not merely a stage, but an invitation. She slid the notebook into her reticule, rising to her feet as footsteps echoed in the hall behind her. She turned to find Constable Fletcher entering, his eyes widening at her discovery. Miss Marple, he breathed. I thought I searched every inch of this place. She offered him a gentle smile. Searches often miss what we least expect, but now we have proof of intent. She tapped the notebook, and a likely confidant. Who urged the Reverend to that very spot? He nodded, respect mingling with astonishment in his gaze. I shall compare this handwriting with the parish letters. As Miss Marple made her exit, the hall's emptiness seemed to whisper its secrets at last. The missing sugar cube, the peony petal, the loose bolts, the gardener's soil, and this faded invitation. Each clue was a thread that, when woven together, would reveal the tapestry of motive, but only if she resisted the temptation to leap to conclusions. Tucking her reticule close, Miss Marple stepped into the late afternoon sun, her mind alight with possibilities. The village's ordinary facades concealed extraordinary truths, and she, the unlikeliest of detectives, would unpick each stitch until the murderer, whoever they might be, could hide no more. Chapter 4. Secrets Behind Closed Doors. Late afternoon sun slanted across Church Lane as Miss Marple stepped briskly toward the Hartley residence. The cottage's honey-colored brick glowed warmly, betraying none of the tension within. On her way, she passed the vicarage, where Reverend Halwyn sat on the porch steps, his hat pulled low and a small vial of belladonna test reagent in hand. He rose as she approached, offering her a gentle nod. "Miss Marple," he greeted, voice still soft from yesterday's ordeal. "I have examined the sugar cube wrapper under strong light and found a faint discoloration, just as Mr. Crane predicted." He extended the wrapper, and she leaned close, noting a tiny amber stain. "I dare say it was belladonna." Miss Marple acknowledged the revelation with a quiet sigh. "Thank you, Reverend. That confirms our worst suspicions. Whoever handled that cube knew exactly what to do, and they concealed their work in plain sight." She returned the wrapper and tucked it carefully into her reticule. "I'll bring this to Constable Fletcher for corroboration. In the meantime, please rest and avoid any return to sugar." Halwyn inclined his head, clutching his vial as if it were a talisman. "I shall. And Miss Marple, be careful whom you accuse. People's tempers run high in times of fear. I appreciate your concern," she replied. "But truth demands patience more than caution." With that, she resumed her stroll, leaving the curate to his solitude. Ahead loomed the Hartley cottage gate, its wrought iron bars draped with climbing roses. Inside, Miss Hartley paced the tidy hallway, her slender shoulders drawing in the scent of fresh straw in the guest room. The moment the door opened, she stopped, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Miss Marple." She stammered. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said kindly. "I trust you are well." She stepped inside, noting the faint aroma of lavender from the drawer where Miss Hartley stowed her gloves. "Better, thank you," the young woman replied, smoothing the front of her simple frock. Her voice wavered slightly. "I apologize if you find my presence here suspicious. Suspicion is a heavy burden," Miss Marple said, choosing her words deliberately. "I seek only to understand what happened. May I ask about the note you discarded last week, the invitation to the days at 3 o'clock? Miss Hartley's cheeks flushed. "I thought it a prank. I recognized the handwriting, but did not wish to encourage it, so I threw it aside. And yet, you found yourself near the sugar bowl before the party?" Miss Marple observed, folding her hands. "Hilda mentioned you lingered in the pantry." "Yes," Miss Hartley admitted, glancing away. I felt anxious about the event. It was my first time attending one of Mrs. Pendlebury's gatherings. I needed a moment alone to steady my nerves." Miss Marple nodded. "Understandable. But did you notice anything at the sugar drawer? Did you see the cube removed, or the drawer unlocked?" The young woman shook her head. "No, I did not touch it. I chose that moment simply to gather myself and to read the invitation once more. I was curious why it addressed me. Afterward, I replaced the note where I found it, on the edge of the dresser, and left." She swallowed. "I had no idea it would lead to this." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Your presence does raise questions, but your fear seems genuine. I shall keep this in mind." She rose to leave but paused. "One thing, Miss Hartley, what prompted you to recognize the handwriting?" Miss Hartley's eyes filled. "It was Uncle's, my late uncle, Graham Whitford. He died 3 years ago. His letters had a flourish in his loops. I thought he might have been reaching out from beyond the grave," she added softly. "I didn't wish to believe someone meddled with me." Miss Marple pinched her shawl. "People hold on to old grievances, and sometimes messages travel through unexpected channels." She offered a comforting smile. "Thank you for your candor," with a gentle nod. She departed, leaving Miss Hartley to her solitude. Before dusk, Miss Marple visited the Pendlebury drawing room once more, intending to confer with Mrs. Pendlebury about a discrepancy in the guest list. The widow received her beside the lace-curtained window, looking fatigued as she clutched a cup of mint tea. "Eloise, Miss Marple began. "I've reviewed your guest registry and cross-referenced it with yesterday's attendance. There is one name signed but unaccounted for, Mr. Frederick Alcott. Your solicitor." Mrs. Pendlebury's eyes flickered. "Yes, Frederick Alcott. He arrived promptly for the toast and then left soon after, citing urgent work at his office. And you did not see him again?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Pendlebury shook her head. "No, he left in his motor car and returned not at all. I assumed he spent the day in town," she sighed. "He has been distant lately. After my husband's passing, our business affairs fell to him, and he grew accustomed to managing them alone." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the silver tea service. One teapot remained unused, its lid polished but never lifted. "And your solicitor did not partake in tea beyond the singular toast?" "No," Mrs. Pendlebury confirmed. "He barely nibbled the scones. He has never much cared for tea." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Eloise. I shall look into Mr. Alcott's movements." She paused, noticing a silver sugar tongs beside the teacup. The tongs' prongs bore a tiny nick. She lifted them gingerly, inspecting the dent under lamplight. "Curious, this tongs has been repaired before. Do you know when it was last serviced?" Mrs. Pendlebury frowned. "Long ago, I believe. It belonged to my grandmother, and once the prongs bent, my uncle repaired it with a small hammer. I never thought much of it." Miss Marple replaced the tongs. "Another heirloom with signs of history. Thank you." Evening settled softly over Cherryford as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where the sergeant had gathered samples of soil, petals, and teacup shards on a polished oak desk. He greeted her with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've compared the handwriting in the notebook you found to various letters in the parish archives. It matches this note slipped beneath Halwyn's door." He passed her the scrap of paper, and she read, "If you wish the truth, meet me alone. Under the days, at 3. She nodded, gently folding the note. "Thank you. Any news of Mr. Alcott?" Miss Marple leaned closer, noting a faint footprint in the soil. "Too small for Reynolds's stout boot. Someone walked here recently," she said, brushing the edge of her parasol along the teenage print. "Only a few hours ago, I'd say." Reynolds stared. "I was the only one supposed to be here since yesterday evening." He rubbed his chin. "But now I recall seeing Miss Hartley slip past the window after dusk. I thought she was seeking the rose fragrance." Miss Marple gently pressed her fingertip into the soil. "Did she disturb the soil or leave any items behind?" The gardener pointed to a corner where a single white glove lay half buried beneath a clay pot. Its fingers were flecked with soil and stained faintly amber. "That wasn't here this morning," he said, picking it up gingerly. Miss Marple opened her reticule and produced a small vial of testing reagent. Dabbing the glove's stain yielded a subtle pink hue. Belladonna once more. She closed the vial and wrapped the glove in paper. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. You've been invaluable." Before departing, Miss Marple surveyed the rows of plants, each a silent sentinel to clandestine movements. She noted scuff marks on the tiled floor and a single peony stem resting against the wall, its petals dried but intact. Whoever prowled here had brushed past the day's petal the previous day, then returned under cover of darkness. By late morning, Miss Marple found herself back at the village hall, where Constable Fletcher awaited her arrival. He handed her a small leather-bound ledger, Mrs. Pendlebury's guest list. Beside it lay the silver key, the glove, and a handful of soil. The sergeant eyed the collection solemnly. "You've been busy," he commented. Miss Marple laid the items out on the dais itself, as though inviting them to speak. "We have evidence of unauthorized entry into both the pantry and the greenhouse. The glove indicates someone carried poison here. Yet the soil marks show a second traversal from greenhouse to dais. We must ask, who moved between these points unseen?" Fletcher tapped the ledger. This record shows Mr. Creighton, the Bensons, Miss Hartley, and Mr. Alcott all in attendance, but only 2 of them knew the sugar drawer's key, and even fewer ventured into the greenhouse. Miss Marple nodded. Let us consider motive. The sugar dibs were insider knowledge, but belladonna requires intent. Someone combined privilege with opportunity, and perhaps a grudge. Fletcher frowned. Who among them might bear such resentment? Mr. Creighton for lost inheritance? Mrs. Benson for social slight? Miss Hartley for? Miss Marple gently shook her head. We must remain open. There is, however, a notable absence. Mrs. Sedgwick, the tea shop owner, did not attend the party. Yet her gossip thrives on scandal. Could she have acted in absentia? The sergeant's eyebrows rose. You think she might have slipped in via the pantry or greenhouse? She smiled faintly. Perhaps. She knows every path of this hall and grounds, and her rose-water tort might conceal more than flavor. That afternoon, Miss Marple paused outside Mrs. Sedgwick's tea shop, where the windows displayed fresh pastries and a closed for private functions sign. Inside, the air was heavy with sugar and brewed tea. Mrs. Sedgwick herself emerged from the back room, her cheeks rosy and eyes darting. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? She asked, smoothing flour from her apron. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to a rack of rosewater torts, each crowned with fresh petals. I wondered about your absence at Mrs. Pendlebury's gathering. The shopkeeper laughed, though tension creased her brow. I was ill, you see, a headache. Best to remain here, where I can rest among my confections. She reached for a cake. Would you care for a slice? Miss Marple declined. Tell me, Mrs. Sedgwick, did you ever enter the greenhouse at the Pendlebury estate? The baker's hand froze. Greenhouse? Certainly not. I have no reason to walk through their grounds at night. And the pantry? Mrs. Sedgwick's lips thinned. Why would I enter their kitchen? They can lock their own doors. Miss Marple studied her. Yet someone with knowledge of the sugar key might not need the original, perhaps a duplicate hidden in a place only you would know. The woman's eyes flickered. That's preposterous. She tightened her apron string. I have nothing to do with this foolishness. Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course. She stepped back, offering a polite curtsy. Thank you for your time. As evening settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the weight of clues heavy in her reticule. She laid out the new evidence beside that which she had already gathered. The silver key with soil residue, the belladonna-stained glove, the ribbon frayed at the pantry hook, and the guest ledger noting Mrs. Sedgwick's absence. By candlelight, she traced lines between each item, mapping movements through the kitchen, greenhouse, and hall. She paused when she reached the glove, noting its delicate stitching and size far too small for Mrs. Sedgwick's robust hands. Too fine for Mr. Creighton's. Its slender form suggested a woman's glove, likely Miss Hartley's, yet she had claimed none as hers. Her pen hovered over her notepad. Silver key, access to sugar. Soil suggests greenhouse passage. Belladonna glove, poison handling in greenhouse. User female, small-handed ribbon, lost in scullery sink. Someone hurried, washing evidence. Missing guest, Mrs. Sedgwick absent, but familiar with hall. Improbable. Miss Hartley, present in pantry and greenhouse. Note from GW invites her alone. Miss Marple set down the pen and considered each thread. The note signed GW. Miss Hartley's late uncle seemed allure, but the glove's size and soil tie her to the greenhouse. Hilda's testimony and Reynolds's footprint corroborated a solitary nocturnal visitor, and the ribbon's fraying implied a rushed escape from the scullery. She rose and lit the lantern beside her bed, exhaustion heavy in her bones, yet her mind alight with possibilities. Tomorrow, she would confront Miss Hartley with the glove, seek clarity from Mr. Alcott on his after-party movements, and investigate whether Hilda Farnsworth had opportunity to forge duplicates of the silver key. But one fact stood clear. The poisoner's footsteps had traced a circuit of trust, through family heirlooms, familiar kitchens, and secret gardens before striking at the heart of Cherryford's genteel calm. Laying out her shawl on the chair, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment's respite, certain that by tomorrow night, the silent steps between pantry and greenhouse would lead her to the one who dared to kill with sugar and conceal it among petals and soil. Until then, she would rest her sharp mind a watchful sentinel even in slumber. Chapter 6. Shadows of Suspicion. The sun rose over Cherryford in a pale, hesitant light, as though even the heavens waited with trepidation for Miss Marple's next inquiries. Mid-morning found her once more at the Hartley cottage, where the delicate greenery of the climbing jasmine brushed against the leaded windows. Inside, Miss Hartley sat at her writing desk, pen poised over a blank sheet of stationery, as though seeking the courage to confess what she could not speak aloud. "Good morning, Miss Hartley," Miss Marple began gently, closing the door behind her. "I hope the night's rest brought you peace." The young woman nodded, though her hands trembled. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I have hardly slept, wondering if my uncle's name has been misused." Miss Marple seated herself on a straight-backed chair. "You told me the invitation carried your Uncle Graham Whitford's handwriting. Might I compare that handwriting with the entry in the notebook found beneath the days?" Miss Hartley exhaled and retrieved a small leather-bound album from a drawer. Opening it, she turned to a page of letters penned by Graham Whitford, each line flowing with the same elegant loops. She pointed to the page. "See here his flourish on the G, and the way he tailors his T's." Miss Marple leaned forward, studying the curls and dots. Then she fetched the notebook from her reticule and placed it beside the album. The handwriting was identical, yet the ink fresh and the paper pristine. "Graham Whitford died in 1925, she observed. "This entry is dated May 16, 1928. What might explain that?" Miss Hartley's eyes brimmed with tears. "I was certain it could not be him, but someone used his style to lure me here to undermine my reputation." She paused, trembling. "I suspected Mrs. Pendlebury's solicitor, Mr. Alcott. He once quarreled with my parents over my uncle's estate. They said he stood to gain from family tensions." Miss Marple nodded. "A motive indeed. Yet the soil on this glove and the footprints in the greenhouse suggest someone smaller in stature. Perhaps a woman." She placed the glove on the desk between them. "This belonged to you." Miss Hartley's hand shook as she reached for it, then withdrew. "No, I never wore such fine gloves in the garden. These are not mine." "Then you see someone else with small hands, familiar with your uncle's handwriting, and with access to this cottage." Miss Marple tapped her pencil. "Would you show me all who might have had keys here?" Miss Hartley considered. "Only myself and my maid Edith. She has served our family since I was a child." She rose and fetched a heavy key ring from a cabinet. 3 brass keys jangled together. "This one opens my front door, that one the guest room trunk, and the third the desk drawer where I keep personal letters." Miss Marple lifted each in turn, noting their shapes. "And Edith? She has a duplicate of my front door key, yes, though I have never given her the desk or drawer keys." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, slipping the keys into her reticule. "I shall speak with Edith next." Her next visit was to the Benson residence just off Church Lane. The afternoon light played through stained glass windows, painting the carpet in jewel-bright hues. Mr. and Mrs. Benson received her together, he offering tea, she hovering behind him like a protective sentinel. "Thank you for seeing me again," Miss Marple began. "I hope my questions do not strain your hospitality." Mrs. Benson offered a tight smile. "Not at all. We wish only to assist." Miss Marple accepted a cup, noting the delicate china matched the set used at the hall. "I wanted to revisit your recollection of the sugar cube found by your settee." She retrieved the half-melted cube from her reticule and held it to the light. "Do you recognize this?" Mr. Benson peered closely. It looks like one from our tea service, yes. The biscuit shape is distinct. Mrs. Benson frowned. But we keep our sugar cubes in a silver box on the sideboard. I cannot imagine how one came here. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Yet it bears the same belladonna residue. Someone dropped a second cube here, perhaps when startled. You mentioned earlier that Mrs. Hartley carried a small book on your walk back. Could you recall the book's appearance? Mr. Benson leaned forward. It was bound in dark leather, but the clasp had come undone. She clutched it so tightly I thought it was precious. He glanced at his wife. You once said she confided in you something about her uncle's papers. Mrs. Benson nodded, smoothing her apron. She said she found letters suggesting Mr. Alcott manipulated her uncle's finances. She planned to read more in private. Miss Marple tapped her pencil. Did she mention where she read them? In the parlor, after the party, Mrs. Benson replied. She said the gaslight there was steadier than in the hall. So she visited this room, after sipping tea, perhaps carrying sugar cubes in that book pouch? Miss Marple asked gently. Benson cleared his throat. It is possible. I didn't think it of importance. Double quotes. Miss Marple noted the couple's uneasy glances. Thank you for your candor. One last thing. Did either of you see Edith Farnsworth, the maid from the Pendlebury household, in the village yesterday? Mrs. Benson shook her head. No, she stayed at the estate. With that, Miss Marple bid farewell, slipping the cube back into her reticule. Late afternoon, she called upon Mrs. Pendlebury once more, requesting a private audience in the drawing room. The widow offered a seat beside the lace-draped window, her eyes tired but resolute. Eloise, Miss Marple said quietly, I have traced movements from the pantry to the greenhouse, the days to the Benson parlor, and even to Miss Hartley's cottage. But one question remains. Who might have had both means and motive to replicate your sugar key? And Mr. Whitford's handwriting? Mrs. Pendlebury's fingers trembled as she reached for her teacup. I cannot imagine. Except, her voice faltered, except Hilda. She once told me of her family's debts and spoke of the kindness of the Whitford estate. When Uncle Graham died, she hoped for a legacy. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Indeed, Hilda's name had surfaced twice now, first as the gatekeeper of the sugar, then as the only one present at the estate throughout the night. She feared poverty, Mrs. Pendlebury continued, and admired your niece's family, until she discovered the estate was entailed. She was bitter. Miss Marple set down her teacup. I shall see her at once. The kitchen at Pendlebury Estate lay silent beneath the waning light. Hilda Farnsworth stood by the scullery sink, scrubbing a copper pan. She looked up, surprise and fear in her eyes. Miss Marple, she stammered. Have you found something? I have questions, Hilda, Miss Marple replied, folding her hands. Questions about the ribbon in the sink, the missing sugar cube, and the late-night visit to the greenhouse. Would you care to explain your movements last evening? Hilda's shoulders sagged. I went to bed early. I heard nothing after the party. I only came to the kitchen at dawn. Miss Marple paced slowly. Yet the ribbon you hung the key on ended up in the sink. The soil beneath the hook matches that of the greenhouse, and the footprint there fits a small shoe likely yours. She paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. And the glove stained with belladonna, too dainty for Mr. Creighton, too small for Mrs. Benson. A maid's glove, I would think. Hilda's eyes brimmed with tears. I wanted to help Miss Hartley. She confided in me about her uncle's letters. She feared Mr. Alcott would steal her inheritance. I only retrieved the sugar cube to add a harmless dose, just enough to make her unwell, so she'd be unable to travel and forced to stay here until we proved Uncle's will invalid. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. You intended a mild inconvenience, not murder. Hilda shook her head. I did not want to kill him. I panicked when the curate fell ill. I dropped the cube in the Benson parlor when I went to fetch cleaning supplies. I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple studied her. And the notebook beneath the days, the invitation to the curate, how does that fit? Hilda's confession trembled. I wrote it. I thought if he met Miss Hartley alone, he might overhear her speak of her uncle's papers and perhaps lend his support to contest the will. I did not think of a gun. Her voice trailed off. Hilda realized she was stumbling into confession beyond her aim. Miss Marple folded her shawl around her shoulders. Thank you, Hilda. Your intentions may have begun with charity, but your actions crossed a threshold no one should approach. We will need your full account for the sergeant. Hilda sank to the floor, sobbing. I'm so sorry. That night, Miss Marple returned home under a sky heavy with stars, each seeming to watch in silent judgment. She laid out her evidence once more: Hilda's apron, soil from the pantry hook, the frayed ribbon, the glove, and the notebook. Beside them, two new items: Hilda's scrubbing rag, stained amber, and a duplicate silver key. Crafted by her late father as a memento, she drew a deep breath. The map of movements had led her here through deceit born of misplaced loyalty, through shadows cast by fear of poverty and longing for justice. Yet one piece remained unplaced, the revolver beneath the days, its presence still unexplained. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would speak with Mr. Alcott and the curate once more, to understand the gun's role in this tragedy. But for now, she allowed herself a moment's pause, her mind sifting through the motives and missteps that had brought Cherryford to this brink. In the hush of her cottage, she whispered to the night, the final piece awaits in the last confession. Chapter 7. The hidden trigger. Morning's pale light gathered in the Delworst Arms courtyard, where Miss Marple descended from her motor car and found Mr. Frederick Alcott pacing beside the hitching post. His dark overcoat billowed in the chill breeze, and his eyes, usually placid behind silver pince-nez, now bore sharp restlessness. As she approached, he halted, offering a curt nod. Miss Marple, he greeted, voice measured. I trust you slept well? Quite so, she replied, smoothing her shawl. Thank you for meeting me again, Mr. Alcott. I wish to discuss your movements yesterday afternoon and, if I may, the revolver discovered beneath the days. Alcott's composed veneer flickered. He bowed his head. Yes, the revolver. I confess I know nothing of its presence. When the revolver was shown to me, I was as surprised as any of the attendees. Miss Marple folded her hands. And yet, you were the only guest who left the hall promptly after proposing the toast. Your motorcar door undoubtedly closed softly to avoid drawing attention, but eyewitnesses place it in the high street for nearly an hour. The solicitor inclined his head. I had urgent matters at the bank and estate matter requiring signatures. I returned as soon as I could, but found the hall in disarray. She studied him. May I see your bank receipt? Alcott produced a small envelope and handed her the stamped deposit slip, dated yesterday at 3:15 p.m. The time aligned with his departure, but left a narrow window round the 3 o'clock rendezvous. Under the days, the bank is only a 10-minute drive away, he noted. I hurried back at once. Miss Marple tucked the slip into her reticule. Thank you. Now, regarding the revolver, we found it with no fingerprints to identify its wielder. Yet someone placed it deliberately to suggest an assassination attempt on you, or on perhaps someone else. Alcott's brown it. You think the weapon was to be used not merely for intimidation? She nodded. A loaded firearm, positioned within easy reach of a seated guest, implies lethal intent. And the guns make a Colt .32 automatic was among the few permitted for private ownership, though scarcely common in Cherryford. The solicitor inhaled. I purchased one in London some years ago, for protection during a turbulent enterprise. I keep it secured at my chambers. He paused. You suspect I brought it here? I suspect someone brought it, Miss Marple replied, but not necessarily you. The key question is motive. Who would wish you or any other attendee dead? And why combine poisoning with a firearm? Alcott's gaze flickered toward the pub door, beyond which the village constable awaited. It seems someone hoped the dual threat would mislead investigators. Poison for the Reverend, and a bullet for me. He frowned. Yet Reverend Halwyn was the only one poisoned. Precisely. Miss Marple unfolded her notebook. The note slipped under his door sign GW, lured him alone beneath the days, where the gun lay in wait. But it was not the gun that struck him. It was the sugar cube. Alcott swallowed. So the gun was a red herring. It appears so. She met his eyes. We must discover who positioned it and why. Before he could speak, Reverend Halwyn appeared in the doorway, escorted by Constable Fletcher. The curate's steps were steady. The residue of illness had faded from his cheeks. He smiled wanly at Miss Marple. I wish to partake in these inquiries. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you for joining us. She turned to Fletcher. Sergeant, did the ballistics report indicate the weapon was recently fired? Fletcher produced a small slip. No. The cylinder shows no recent discharge, no traces of powder or rifling from a spent cartridge. He tapped the report. It was loaded but unused. Halwyn frowned. Then the gun's purpose was symbolic, not functional, or its use was thwarted. Miss Marple suggested, if someone intended to shoot the solicitor and changed their mind upon seeing Reverend Halwyn, instead they might have reloaded or removed a cartridge. But our ballistics show no such tampering. All 6 chambers remain loaded. Alcott ran a hand through his hair. I cannot imagine who would wish to harm me, let alone deliver such theatrics at an innocent garden party. Miss Marple nodded. Your motive, as solicitor to the Pendlebury and the Whitford estates, entangled you in disputes over inheritance. Yet the attempt seems broader, targeting both legal authority and spiritual authority in one fell swoop. Halwyn exchanged a glance with Alcott. Intriguing, and perhaps personal. The curate's moral stands likely galled certain parishioners, while the solicitor's business dealings bred resentment in others. Miss Marple turned to Fletcher. Have you compared the gun's serial number with any registered purchases in the county? The sergeant produced a ledger. Yes, the firearm is registered to Mr. Cragen, a London collector. Loaned to Alcott with permission. Then the gun's provenance points back to you, Mr. Alcott. Miss Marple said gently, yet your alibi holds, and there are no prints. We must consider a third party, someone who accessed your chambers to borrow the revolver. Alcott exhaled. My chambers in London are secure. Only I and my clerk, Mr. Gibbs, hold keys. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. You have a clerk? Yes, an eager young man, conscientious to a fault. I scarcely know him beyond his duties. Halwyn's gaze sharpened. Where is he now? He remains in London, assisting with end-of-quarter accounts. Alcott hesitated. I could summon him, if needed. Miss Marple inclined her head. Please do. Meanwhile, let us consider those here in Cherryford with access to the gun. Who among us has familiarity with firearms? The curate shook his head. Only our retired officers, Mr. Thorne, possibly Mrs. Benson's brother. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Alec Thorne served in India, accustomed to sidearms. He stood near the dais as the toast was made. Alcott sighed. He was fully engaged in conversation with Mrs. Sedgwick at that moment. Conversations which could have concealed a slip away to linger beneath the dais. Miss Marple mused. But would he poison the curate's sugar cube afterward? Unlikely. Thorne arrived then dapper, in a crisp blazer, his uniform absent, but his bearing military. Fletcher ushered him forward. Alec, could you account for your movements between 3 and 3:30 yesterday? Thorne squared his shoulders. Certainly. Mrs. Sedgwick and I strolled the veranda seeking cooler air. We spoke at length about her new rosewater tort. I did not stray beyond the veranda until the noise erupted. Mrs. Sedgwick, summoned to confirm, repeated the claim. They walked arm in arm until the scream. Her cheeks were mortified at the mention of the colt and the colt's proximity to aid the vicar. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you. One more question. Mr. Thorne, did you notice anyone moving about the perimeter among the shrubs or behind the curtains?" Thorne frowned. "Now that you ask, I could have sworn I glimpsed a figure slipping behind the greenhouse near the eastern wall." He snapped his fingers. "I thought it was the gardener, a shadow among the plants." Reverend Halwyn's eyes widened. "That corresponds to the timeline. He reached the days moments before the toast, mistaking me for his mark." Miss Marple tapped her reticule. "Indeed, the sequence suggests retrieve the revolver from private storage in Alcott's chambers, or from another hiding place. Place it beneath the days. Return to the greenhouse to plant the glove, soil, and peony petal as false trails. Fetch the sugar cube. Poison the curate. Then create alarm with the scream." Alcott's face paled. "This requires preparation and intimate knowledge of the hall's layout." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly. Someone with insider access, someone who knew the sugar key, the greenhouse path, the day's construction, and the solicitor's gun registration." Silence fell, broken only by the distant toll of church bells. The assembled looked at one another, realizing the net was tightening. Miss Marple closed her notebook. "We shall await Mr. Gibbs's testimony and compare handwriting on the revolver's resting note. If one exists with that in the notebook, signed G.W. But for now, let us recall that every misdirection, the glove, the soil, the petal, was designed to lead us in circles. Tomorrow, at the vicarage, I shall test the sugar cube remnants from each location for traces of other toxins or fingerprints. Until then, we must remain vigilant. The true architect of this chaos remains at large, and they will likely attempt another distraction to conceal their identity." With that, she excused herself, leaving Alcott and Halwyn to confer with Fletcher and Thorne outside. The morning mist had dissolved into a crisp clarity, an echo of her purpose. Somewhere in Cherryford, the murderer moved among the innocents, their secrets intact. But Miss Marple's patient scrutiny, like the clearing sky, would soon reveal the darkest truth hidden in the village's gentle fawade. Chapter 8. Trials of Ink. An Alibithi late morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of the vicarage study, illuminating the oak desk where Miss Marple had arranged her tools, magnifier, reagent vials, and remnants of sugar cubes from each scene. Reverend Halwyn, his throat still tender but his resolve firm, joined her, carrying a small porcelain dish with fragments of tea leaves. The sergeant stood by, notebook in hand and keen to record each observation. "Thank you for accommodating us, Reverend," Miss Marple said, placing the dish on a velvet cloth. "It will be helpful to compare the sugar residues from the hall, the Benson parlor, and the Hartley cottage." Halwyn inclined his head. "Of course, Miss Marple. Anything to aid the investigation." Miss Marple retrieved the test reagent and added a single drop to each sugar sample in turn. The first fragment, from under the days, turned a subtle pink belladonna, confirmed. The second, from the Benson parlor, yielded the same hue. The third, from the Hartley cottage, produced only a faint yellow tinge suggestive of a different substance, perhaps harmless coloring or a residual stain from a confection. She nodded thoughtfully. "So the poisoner handled the Hartley cube as well, and yet it failed to produce the intended effect," she murmured. "This suggests haste or confusion in the delivery." She set the dish aside and turned to the sergeant. "Please record that all cubes bore belladonna except the Hartley fragment, which exhibits only chromatic residue." The sergeant obliged, his pen scratching across the page. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the garden beyond, but within the study, tension filled every corner. "Now," Miss Marple continued, "we await Mr. Gibbs, Mr. Alcott's clerk, to address the revolver's provenance. In the meantime, I propose we revisit the handwriting samples." to ascertain whether the note beneath the days and that slipped under the curate's door truly share a common hand. The vicar placed a framed letter from Graham Whitford beside the notebook entry from the days. Miss Marple examined both, her magnifier tracing the curves of each loop. Then, drawing a sheet of tracing paper over each, she compared the pressure points and idiosyncratic flicks on the final G, only to discover subtle differences. The note beneath the days bore a heavier downward stroke on the T-cross, whereas Mr. Whitford favored a lighter, upward flick. She tapped the tracing paper. "These are not identical," she announced. "They mimic one another, but the execution differs. The day's note is a forgery intended to implicate Miss Hartley by invoking a beloved uncle now deceased." Halwyn's brow furrowed. Indeed, whoever penned the day's note sought to send the curate on a fool's errand, luring him into danger, while clouding the trail with family sentiment. Miss Marple nodded. "We can therefore discount Miss Hartley's involvement in crafting that invitation, though she may have read it and acted upon it. Let us turn our attention to Mr. Gibbs, perhaps. His testimony regarding the revolver's storage and handling will shed light on that instrument's appearance beneath the days." A knock at the door preceded the entrance of Mr. Albert Gibbs, a slender young man in a suit that strained at the shoulders. His expression was anxious, yet he bowed courteously before the assembled party. "Miss Marple, Reverend Sergeant, good morning," he said. His voice wavered. "Mr. Alcott sent me at once upon learning of the gun's discovery." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Thank you for hurrying down from London, Mr. Gibbs. We appreciate your cooperation." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Gibbs settled, clutching a leather portfolio. Halwyn poured tea, and the clerk accepted a cup with trembling hands. "Mr. Gibbs," Miss Marple began, "we understand you maintain the keys to Mr. Alcott's chambers and assist him in securing his private effects, among them the Colt .32 automatic. Could you describe your role in storing that firearm?" Gibbs swallowed. "Yes, Miss Marple. The gun is registered to Mr. Alcott, and by law it must remain in a locked cabinet at his chambers. I hold the cabinet key and ensure only he or myself, in his absence, supplies it. I have never removed the gun without his explicit instructions." "Have you ever allowed anyone else to handle the weapon?" Miss Marple asked. "No, never. It is too dangerous." He paused. "There was one exception. Several months ago, Mr. Alcott lent the gun to his cousin Mr. Harold Benson while visiting London. He needed protection during a meeting. The pistol was returned intact, and I relocked the cabinet." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the sergeant. "That is the same Mr. Benson whose sugar cube we found in his parlor." Gibbs blinked. "Yes, he accompanied Mr. Alcott on legal matters then. But I have no record of any other loans. Could you demonstrate how you lock and unlock the cabinet?" Miss Marple requested. Gibbs produced a small brass key and fished it from his waistcoat pocket. He excused himself and retrieved the gun cabinet from a corner. Kneeling, he unlocked the door and opened it carefully, revealing the Colt nestled in a leather-lined cradle. Miss Marple observed his movements, the key's smooth action, the deliberate care in handling the gun, the gloved fingertips avoiding the trigger guard. When Gibbs returned the pistol to its cradle and relocked the door, Miss Marple escorted him back to the desk. "Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Your demonstration confirms that the revolver's presence beneath the days could not have occurred without someone accessing your chamber's key or borrowing the gun from you while you were away." She paused. "Where did you stay last night?" Gibbs frowned. "In London, at my rooms in Holborn. I arrived on the 8 o'clock train." "Is there any possibility you left earlier or that someone retrieved the pistol in transit?" Miss Marple asked. He shook his head emphatically. "No, I remained on the train until its arrival. I then took a carriage directly home, locked the gun cabinet, and went to bed." No one could have intercepted the pistol en route. Miss Marple rested her chin on one hand. Very well. Your account is consistent, if we accept your integrity. Yet the pistol's journey to Cherryford remains unexplained. We must consider whether someone copied your key or obtained the gun by other means. Gibbs drew himself up, but the cabinet key is a unique fit. It was made for the lock. No duplicate exists. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the sergeant. Then the pistol may not have come from its rightful cabinet. It may have been transferred to another hiding place, perhaps in Mrs. Pendlebury's greenhouse locker, or beneath the days itself, a compartment no one noticed until yesterday. She clicked her tongue. A secret space within the day's boards could have concealed the gun for weeks, only requiring a careful eye to replace it beneath the cushions in time for the party. Gibbs frowned. I never considered that, he bowed. I will return to London tonight and examine the records for any missing time in my duties. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. That will be most useful. Until then, let us continue our inquiry here. Gibbs departed by carriage, and the vicarage study fell into a hush. Outside, birdsong drifted through the open windows, but within, contemplation reigned. Miss Marple rose, gathering her notes. Let us reconvene at the village hall this afternoon to inspect the days more thoroughly. There may be a hidden latch or an unnoticed cavity one that eluded our earlier scrutiny in daylight. Sergeant Fletcher stood. We shall make arrangements. Meanwhile, Reverend, I believe you had questions for Mrs. Benson regarding the sugar cube found by her settee? The curate nodded. Yes. Mrs. Benson joined me yesterday for a brief question of propriety, not regarding the key, but concerning the cube. I wish to know why the cube bore the shape of your family's service. Mrs. Benson, summoned from her cottage, arrived looking pale but poised. She repeated her earlier account. She kept the sugar cubes in a silver box, accessible to no one but herself. She claimed ignorance of how a cube came to rest by her sofa. Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Benson, did you notice any unusual behavior in your husband's manner toward Miss Hartley as you escorted her home? Mrs. Benson hesitated, fingers twitching. He was solicitous, perhaps. She was distressed by the events at the hall, and he wished to offer comfort. I see. And did you prepare tea for the curate when he visited your parlor? Halwyn asked. She flushed. I only offered him water. He seemed unwell, so I thought sugar might aggravate his condition. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Your kindness may have provided an unintended alibi for the poisoner who, startled by your arrival in the parlor, dropped the cube and fled the room. Mrs. Benson's shoulders slumped. I did not mean harm. She bowed her head. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. No one does. Yet these actions, combined with others, form our path to truth. That afternoon, before investigators Miss Marple, Halwyn, Fletcher, and Alcott assembled at the village hall, Fletcher unlocked the side door, and they climbed onto the dais together. The boards gleamed where footprints had indented the earth below, and Miss Marple knelt to inspect each plank. With gloves, please, she instructed. Each took a pair and followed as she probed along the plank's edges. Near the center, beneath the hem of the dais curtain, she discovered a narrow seam too uniform to be accidental. She tapped lightly with her parasol handle. A faint click echoed. She pressed a hidden catch, and one board lifted to reveal a shallow compartment lined with felt, and just large enough to conceal the revolver. Inside lay the Colt, untouched, and a small scrap of paper with the initials AS scrawled hastily. Reverend Halwyn reached for the gun, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Wait, Reverend. Do not disturb the paper. She retrieved it and smoothed it flat. The initials reminded her of someone with motive and access. Amelia Sedgwick, the tea shop proprietor, who had been absent from the party, yet intimately familiar with the hall's layout. She pointed to the initials. AS, likely Mrs. Sedgwick's. She knew the greenhouses, the garden party planning, and the hall's hidden features, having provided tarts and refreshments for every village function. She had reason to oppose both the solicitor and the curate, for her cake sales dropped with each scandal they presided over. Alcott crossed his arms. But why implicate Miss Hartley with my uncle's handwriting? And why poison the curate, a man of God whom no one despised severely enough to kill? Miss Marple met his gaze. Because a double crime serves to distract. The forgery of the note and the poison convinced everyone to look at Miss Hartley. The hidden gun threatened you, sowing further confusion. Meanwhile, the true culprit could operate unseen. The sergeant pocketed the scrap. We have our prime suspect, then. Miss Marple nodded. But we require confirmation. Mrs. Sedgwick's initials are a clue, but not proof. We must find evidence linking her to the hidden compartment and the sugar cube wrappers. Fletcher straightened. I will obtain a warrant to search her tea shop and home. Miss Marple stood, brushing dust from her gloves. Do so at once. Meanwhile, let us not spread panic. We shall confront her with our findings only once we hold the evidence in hand. As they descended the dais and departed the hall, a sense of resolution stirred in the chill air. The net had tightened, the initials ES glowing like embers in the growing dusk. Yet Miss Marple knew that certainty required one final test, a psychological gambit, to draw Mrs. Sedgwick into the open, where her reaction would speak louder than any confession. She allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Tomorrow, the quiet village of Cherryford would witness the unveiling of its darkest secret. Chapter 9. The Sweet Sting of Deception. Dawn mist had barely lifted from Cherryford's cobblestones when Miss Marple set out for Amelia Sedgwick's tea shop, determined to follow the trail of the initials AS. She approached the ivy-clad storefront with measured steps, its windows still darkened by the overnight shutters bearing the handwritten sign, "Closed for private functions." Within lay the linchpin of the village's unraveling peace. Miss Marple paused at the door and tapped gently. After a moment, the bolt slid back, and Mrs. Sedgwick herself appeared, wrapped in a shawl of dark wool. Her rosy cheeks were paler than usual, and her eyes bore an anxious gleam. "Miss Marple," she greeted, forcing a smile. "I wasn't expecting you so early." "Good morning, Mrs. Sedgwick," Miss Marple replied, inclining her head. "I trust you slept well?" The baker drew in a breath. "As well as one can, given recent events." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the piled-up wooden crates inside the shop, each labeled in neat script: flour, sugar, rosewater. She stepped across the threshold, brushing a fingertip along the counter's edge. She noted faint traces of soil dust, peat-like granules, that matched the greenhouse earth clinging to the baseboards. She turned to Mrs. Sedgwick. "I wonder whether you might show me your storeroom. I'm curious about the arrangement of your sugar and flour, and whether any signs of soil or hidden implements might remain." The baker's face flushed. "Of course, come in." She led Miss Marple through the narrow aisle between display cases to a solid oak door at the rear, flipping the bolt with trembling fingers. She opened it to reveal a small storeroom illuminated by a single skylight. Sacks of flour lined one wall, sugar boxes the other. A heavy trunk sat beneath a corner window. Miss Marple inhaled the scent of ground almonds and vanilla. She crossed to the sugar boxes, gently lifting one lid to reveal clean white cubes stamped ES in a looping script. She peered closely. "Your initials?" Mrs. Sedgwick flinched. "I label my products. I use AS for my brand, Amelia Sedgwick's Special." Miss Marple nodded. "I see. And you mix poison into none of these, of course?" The baker stammered. "Of course not. My reputation depends on purity." Yet her hands shook as she reached to close the box. Miss Marple stepped beside the trunk. "May I ask what this contains?" "It's my grandmother's heirlooms," Mrs. Sedgwick replied. "Family silverware and the original recipe for my rosewater tort." Miss Marple lifted the lid and peered inside. Beneath layers of newspaper lay an ornate silver sugar tongs, its prongs bearing a small nick. She withdrew it and turned it over in her hand. "You repaired this?" The baker swallowed. "Yes, my Uncle Bennet by accident years ago. I had it mended at the silversmith's in Brighton." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She held the tongs up to the skylight, and a jagged crack caught the beam. The same nick that appeared on Mrs. Pendlebury's sugar tongs. Mrs. Sedgwick's face paled. I lent her some of my baking utensils for the party. She asked for extra tongs, and I sent them along with the cakes. Thank you," Miss Marple said softly, replacing the tongs. "One more thing. Did you ever keep a small revolver in this storeroom?" Amelia's eyes widened so sharply that the bag of flour behind her threatened to topple. She reached for the trunk's edge. "A revolver? Nonsense, I have no use for firearms." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "And yet, someone with your intimate knowledge of the party's arrangements might have known about the greenhouse keys, the pantry layout, and the Daisy's hidden compartment. Your presence in the storeroom provided the perfect opportunity to conceal the weapon and the sugar." The baker's composure wavered. She opened her trunk, withdrawing folded cloths, until at last she produced a small brass key identical in appearance to the key found beneath the pantry hook. I kept this for emergencies," she whispered. "I once found my house key broken and borrowed a similar key from. I don't know how it matches so precisely. That key fits the sugar drawer, I assure you," Miss Marple said, taking it gently. "And it bears the soil of the greenhouse. You carried it here, then returned it to the pantry hook to conceal your entry." She held out the tongs. "And you retrieved your silver tongs from Mrs. Pendlebury's collection to mask your own." Mrs. Sedgwick buckled. "I only meant to frighten them, the solicitor and the curate." Business was slow after the scandal. With Mrs. Pendlebury's summer fete last year, I believed only a warning was needed to restore decorum. I never dreamed that woman Hilda would poison the curate for real." Miss Marple's eyes remained gentle. "But the classic misdirection, the belladonna, the gun, the note was your design, was it not?" The baker's shoulders sagged. "I wrote the note signed A.S. and placed it beneath the days, as you discovered. I planted the glove in the greenhouse to point suspicion to a maid. Then I slipped the key into Hilda's hook, knowing she would fetch sugar for Reverend Halwyn. She took the bait and dosed him, thinking it harmless. When he fell ill, I panicked, and the revolver remained hidden until Hilda confessed." Miss Marple nodded as if all fell into place. "Your knowledge of the hall's hidden compartments, your access to silverware, and your cunning use of another's naivety were impressive indeed." She paused. "But why involve Hilda? Why not act alone?" The baker closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Hilda looked up to me. I thought she could handle the sugar, and I could oversee the rest. But she was too kind, and I too ambitious." Miss Marple placed a consoling hand on her shoulder. "Fear and ambition can twist the kindest hearts. You have revealed the pattern. Now we must ensure no one else is harmed." Outside, the sergeant called, ready to escort Mrs. Sedgwick to the station. The baker nodded, allowing herself to be guided. Her shoulders hunched beneath the weight of guilt. As Miss Marple gathered the evidence, the brass key, the tongs, the sugar wrappers, she felt the last threads of the mystery align. The village's facade of gentle propriety was rent by jealousy and desperation. But her patient deduction had unveiled the truth. Only the final piece remained. The revolver itself, now recovered and quiet, awaited the missing testimony of its innocent caretaker, Mr. Gibbs. She paused at the doorway, sunlight glinting off the petals of a peony in the window box. "Thank you, Amelia," she said softly. "May your remorse bring you to better days." The baker offered a wan smile. Then followed the sergeant into the bright morning, leaving Miss Marple alone in the now silent tea shop outside. Reverend Halwyn and Mr. Alcott joined her. "I heard," the curate said solemnly. You faced her bravely. Miss Marple folded the key into her reticule. Fear and loneliness can drive one to dark endeavors, but the truth, once perceived, offers a path to redemption for all who err. She tilted her head. Now we must finalize the details. Compare the revolver's compartment paper initial to Mrs. Sedgwick's signature on her business letters, and confirm Mr. Gibbs's timeline in London matches the gun's absence. Then, at last, we shall close the book on Sherryford's cruel game. Mr. Alcott stretched a hand to steady himself. Your insight astounds, Miss Marple. I can scarcely imagine what would have happened had you not intervened. She offered a slight smile. We all played our parts, some more unwittingly than others. It is only fitting that order be restored. As they walked away, the tea shop's roses swayed in the breeze, their scent drifting like faint laughter. The final chapter's pen hovered above the page, ready to script the last lines of revelation and aftermath. But for now, Sherryford exhaled in cautious relief, trusting that its quiet sentinel would soon unveil the last truth and silence the specter of murder. Beneath the Days Forever, Chapter 10, The Unveiling and Aftermath. Be late morning. The village hall once again stood ready for guests, though this time the trestles bore not tea, but chairs arranged in a semicircle. Word had spread that Miss Marple intended to reveal the truth behind the recent calamities, and nearly every villager from Mrs. Pendlebury draped in her widow's black to young Miss Thorpe in prim serge gathered in subdued anticipation. At the front, Miss Marple arranged her evidence on a small table, the silver sugar tongs bearing the telltale nick, the brass key stained with greenhouse soil, the forgery of Graham Whitford's flourish, and a single peony petal pressed beneath glass. Reverend Helwyn and Mr. Frederick Alcott stood at her side, while Sergeant Fletcher and Constable Benson maintained respectful distance. Miss Marple rose and offered a gentle smile. Thank you all for coming. Our village's tranquility was shattered not by strangers, but by someone among us who sought to manipulate trust and weaponize kindness. Today, we shall close the circle of suspicion and restore Sherryford's peace. She gestured toward the tongs. These, by their repair mark, connected the baker, Mrs. Amelia Sedgwick, to Mrs. Pendlebury's tea service. Mrs. Sedgwick, though absent from the gathering, supplied her utensils and with them the guise of innocence. A hush fell as Mrs. Sedgwick's hand trembled, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Miss Marple continued, Next, this brass key found upon the pantry hook and bearing the same peach-rich soil from Mr. Reynolds's greenhouse matched the lock of Mrs. Sedgwick's storeroom here at the shop. It permitted secret entry into the Pendlebury kitchen, where a lone sugar cube was removed and laced with belladonna. She held aloft a glass vial containing the faintly pink-stained cube. That cube nearly felled Reverend Helwyn, who drank in trust. Yet another cube, dropped in the Benson parlor, betrayed the poisoner's haste. Reverend Helwyn, steadier now, stepped forward. When the first evidence emerged, I feared malice against me. Yet as Miss Marple has shown, the poison was but a lure misdirection for a greater ruse. He pointed to a framed scrap of paper. This note, inviting me unto the days, was inscribed in imitation of Mr. Graham Whitford's hand. But the cross strokes betray the forger's heavy hand. Its true author was the baker herself, seeking to draw the curate into peril while sowing suspicion on the innocent. Mr. Alcott cleared his throat, and the revolver beneath the daisy loaded Colt .32 served only to reinforce this chaos. Though registered to my chambers in London, it remained hidden in a secret compartment of the Days one known only to the party planner and her preferred baker. Miss Marple nodded, revealing a small panel lifted to disclose the polished cradle where the gun lay. Mrs. Sedgwick knew of this concealment, having visited the greenhouse at night to place the false trail of glove and petal. She returned to hide the revolver, trusting that panic would cloak her actions. Mrs. Sedgwick stood, her voice trembling. I meant only to teach them a lesson. My taut sails suffered when Mrs. Pendlebury's events turned scandalous. I believed a warning would restore order. I never intended a person, let alone a clergyman, to be harmed. She sank into a chair, tears glistening. I enlisted Hilda in taking the sugar, thinking a harmless dose would do no more than a fainting spell. But fear grew, and the plan unraveled into tragedy. Sergeant Fletcher stepped forward, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You will have the opportunity to explain yourself to the magistrate, Mrs. Sedgwick. Your remorse will be noted, but the law must take its course." The baker nodded, her head bowed, while Mrs. Pendlebury turned away to hide her tears. Miss Marple then addressed Hilda Farnsworth, who stood pale but resolute near the dais. "You, too, bear responsibility. Your admiration for Mrs. Sedgwick led you to do her bidding, yet your heart betrayed you when Reverend Halwyn collapsed in your arms." Hilda's tears fell freely. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I thought we did wrong only to expose the truth. I never meant to kill." Reverend Halwyn offered a gentle nod. "Your repentance is clear. May your honesty guide your redemption." At last, Miss Marple faced the assembled village. "Our community has suffered wounds both physical and emotional. Yet in unveiling these secrets, we affirm that trust need not be shattered." Mrs. Sedgwick's betrayal and Hilda's complicity rose from fear and desperation, emotions in which any human can falter. But restoration comes through transparency and justice, not through silence. Reverend Halwyn stepped forward, vestments now hidden beneath his overcoat. "I shall preach the sermon this Sunday on the frailty of the human heart and the necessity of compassion. Let us remember forgiveness as we seek to rebuild our bonds." He offered a kind smile to Mrs. Sedgwick, who managed a fragile one in return. Alcott added, "I will oversee the revision of Uncle Whitford's will, ensuring Miss Hartley's rightful inheritance. Let this legal matter, once marred by guile, now stand as testament to Cherryford's restored integrity." Finally, Miss Marple gathered her shawl and pen. "My journey here concludes, but the true work to uphold kindness and vigilance begins anew. We have learned that even the sweetest gesture, like a sugar cube, can mask poison, and the softest hand can conceal a dagger. Yet when we face darkness with clear eyes and gentle hearts, we shall never be undone." The villagers rose and, one by one, offered bows of respect to the quiet detective whose unassuming presence had brought light to their darkest hour. Outside, the sun broke through lingering clouds, casting the days in warm glow. As the hall emptied, Miss Marple lingered, gathering each fragment of evidence into her reticule. Then, with a final glance at the restored tranquility of Cherryford, she stepped into the bright afternoon, leaving behind a village once wounded, now whole, and assured in the knowledge that truth like kindness endures.